el gusto, el honor de recibir al profesor Philipp Schwab, quien va a tener a su cargo la primera conferencia magistral de nuestro seminario. Saludo y doy la bienvenida al profesor Schwab. Y voy a hacer una breve presentación en castellano y luego el profesor Schwab dará su conferencia en inglés como está anunciado. El profesor Schwab es profesor ordinario de filosofía con una cátedra sobre la filosofía clásica alemana y su recepción en el Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de Friburgo, en Alemania, departamento del que es actualmente el director. Es también director del proyecto de investigación Schelling en Múnich, edición híbrida de su obra inédita, y del proyecto Lo absoluto y la diferencia, sobre el diálogo entre Schelling y Hegel, proyectos ambos auspiciados por la Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, la Fundación Alemana para la Investigación Científica. También se ha desempeñado como investigador y profesor invitado en el Centro de Investigación Søren Kierkegaard de Copenhague, la Comisión Schelling de la Academia Bávara de Ciencias y Humanidades, la Universidad de Basilea y la Universidad de Chicago. Es autor de muchos artículos y autor o editor de varios libros sobre Hegel, Schelling, Kierkegaard y Schopenhauer. Su último libro, próximo a aparecer, se titula La disputa en torno a la diferencia, Schelling y Hegel acerca del primer principio de la filosofía, Der Streit die Differenz, Schelling und Hegel über das erste Prinzip der Philosophie, un título muy prometedor para el tema de nuestro seminario. El título de su conferencia, como se ha anunciado, es The Principle of the System is in fact only its beginning, Hegel's Dissolution of the First Principle of Philosophy. Dejo con ustedes al profesor Philipp Schwab. Bienvenido y muchas gracias. Bitte schön.
Vielen Dank. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and most of all for the invitation. It is indeed a great honor and a great pleasure to be here with you. Of course, it would be great to be in the same room physically, but it is one of the advantages of the Zoom era, maybe the only advantage, that I can sit in my office and be with you at the same time. So this is wonderful. I am sorry that my Spanish is limited in a way which does not permit me to do the conference in Spanish. So I will do it in English, as Professor Giusti announced, and I will share the screen, and I hope it will work to read along. Is this okay? Do you see that fine? Is it good? Okay,
yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'll just start right away. The productive reappropriations, so I'm starting with some general remarks. The productive reappropriations of German idealism over the past couple of decades, especially in the Anglophone world, have tended to directly link Hegel to Kant, and thereby, at the same time, tended to leave out what happens in between the two. For instance, in his Hegel's Idealism as Radicalization of Kant, John McDowell has famously suggested to distinguish between, on the one hand, the long and complicated route, which Hegel himself takes to achieve his philosophical standpoint in the Phenomenology of Spirit, and on the other hand, a short and more simple route, which can possibly take us from Kant to Hegel quite directly, namely by directly departing from the Kantian deduction, and as McDowell puts it, just eliminate the externality that vitiates Kant's deduction, and then you have Hegel's standpoint. Now, in this slide, what I propose in my work might appear to be a very long and very complicated route. That is to say, I make the case that in order to understand what is going on in Hegel's philosophy, it is indispensable to take into account what happens since Kant and in between Kant and Hegel, or in between the two. Such a very long route, and now I'll qualify what I mean by that, such a very long route is not at all being suggested in terms of historical completeness. It's not to say where there are thinkers between Kant and Hegel and we just need them to be complete in historical terms. And it is certainly not meant to reproduce tiresome simplifications such as a three-step progression of subjective idealism, objective idealism, and absolute idealism as Kroner has it. Neither, one more qualification, neither is this intended to historically garner influences on Hegel by, let's say, Fichte or Schelling. Rather, and now this is what I have in mind, rather the point I'm trying to make is that systematically, and I stress that systematically or in systematic terms, Hegel is just much better understood if we see that and how he starts and departs from some key ideas developed in the immediate aftermath of Kant, mainly in Fichte and Schelling. Most notably, this concerns the key idea in early post-Kantian idealism that there must be one absolute unconditional principle which grounds the entire system of reason. This might provoke some objections, and that's why I'm qualifying it again. This again might appear to be implying a foundationalist image of Hegel, such that his philosophy would rely on a first principle as well. However, precisely the opposite is the case. Rather, what I try to show is that Hegel starts from a fundamental and even unsurmountable difficulty in the idea of a first principle, in Fichte's and Schelling's idea of a first principle, such that Hegel's famous dialectical method and his key notion of negativity amount to a thorough dissolution of the first principle, that is, a productive transformation. And I'll briefly anticipate this key problem, which will be developed in more detail in the following. It is the problem of a transition from the first principle to any further determination of the system, and put more abstractly, the problem of identity and difference, as I have in the title of my forthcoming book. Now, in the talk today, I intend to unfold this idea with regard to the topic of our seminar, that is, the problem of the beginning or the question of the beginning. Thus, what I will try to show in the following is that and how Hegel's equally famous dialectics of the beginning is actually to be read as the very dissolution of the early post-Kantian idea of a beginning, according to which the system must start from and be grounded in one absolute principle. To substantiate this claim, my talk breaks down into three parts. In the first part, I will sketch the basic idea of a first principle in early German idealism and the key problem in this idea, which I take Hegel to be following up on. In this section necessarily will be somewhat broad overview and thus a bit reductive, I'm afraid, but I can't avoid that for the sake of time. In the second part then, I will briefly turn to Hegel's 1801 first published essay, Difference between Fichte's and Schelling's System of Philosophy. Here I think we can see in a first instance that and how Hegel both follows up on and departs from the idea of a first principle. The final third part, which is a bit shorter also, the first one is actually the longest, I'm afraid, because I'm covering a couple of positions. Now the third part, the shorter one, will be a rather close reading. I will basically read some few paragraphs from the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, culminating in a passage where Hegel, for the first time in his published writings, clearly sketches his idea of a dialectics of the beginning, anticipating what he will fully unfold in the opening passages of the Science of Logic. And this passage from the Phenomenology preface shall finally make clear how the proposed dissolution of the first principle works with respect to the beginning. So I'll start with the first section, the first principle in Fichte and Schelling, or from identity to difference. Of course, and I'll just point to some historical background here, of course, the idea of a first principle is already foreshadowed in Kant's philosophy itself, perhaps most notably in the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectics of the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant writes, just to point to that briefly, if we survey the cognitions of our understanding in their entire range, then we find that what reason quite uniquely prescribes and seeks to bring about concerning it is the systematic in cognition, i.e. the interconnection based on one principle, der Zusammenhang aus einem Prinzip. So we have some passages in Kant where he already speaks about this one principle. Another one is in the Critique of Practical Reason. And it is Karl Leonhard Reinhold, to just point to an intermediary step, who further develops this idea. And he's the one who actually makes it the key quest in grounding a unified system of reason in this so-called principle of consciousness, that's des Bewusstseins. Yet in order to keep it brief and concise, I will start with Fichte and Schelling right away, and in a more systematic and maybe a little bit schematic manner, address three basic questions that should shed some light on the matter at hand. And these three questions, structuring the first part, are: why one first principle? That will be rather short. Then why should the I be this first principle? Because that's Fichte's and Schelling's claim in their early works. The I is the first principle of philosophy. And then where I will put the focus is the third question, and where's the problem from identity to difference? So let's start. Why one first principle? And to begin with, we can have a look at a passage from the opening of Schelling's 1795 essay entitled "Of the I as Principle of Philosophy." Now, 20-year-old Schelling, who has definitely read some Fichte, and he confesses that he read Fichte, writes the following: either our knowledge has no reality at all, an eternal spinning, a continuous reciprocal dissolving of all propositions into another, a chaos in which no element can be distinguished, or there has to be one ultimate point of reality on which everything depends, from which all content and all form of our knowledge derives, a point which separates the elements and which circumscribes for each of them the circle of its continuous effect in the universe of knowledge. And I'm highlighting ultimate point here. This passage quite dramatically puts forward the basic either-or as presented in early German idealism. So, again, in my formulations, either there is one well-structured unity of knowledge based on one first original grounding principle, which at the same time constitutes and structures the entire sphere of reason, or there is no knowledge at all, no determinacy in any proposition of our knowledge, but rather the decomposition of reason, die Zerreißung der Vernunft. So then, put on a more abstract level, why must there be, according to Fichte and Schelling, one initial and unconditional grounding principle? And the answer, in short, would amount to this: the first principle is required to secure the unity, die Einheit, the wholeness, die Ganzheit, and the enclosedness, Geschlossenheit of the system of reason. And at the same time, it is required in order to guarantee the determinate position and character of each of the elements within this system. So that's why we need one principle, they think. Second then, and this is important also for the following, why should this first grounding principle be the I? Of course, that's a sort of Cartesian background, but it has a specific form in Fichte and Schelling. Now, while it is obvious that there can be no actual proof of the first principle, for otherwise it wouldn't be the first unconditional principle, it would be conditioned by what we use in the proof. Although there can be no proof, Fichte and Schelling have several strategies for pointing to the I as the first principle. And I will just sketch two of these strategies. There are, of course, more. Now, one prominent strategy runs along the lines of what can be called an Inelectability Argument. In German, I would say Argument der Unhintergehbarkeit. Now, this follows up, of course, on Kant's unity of apperception. Fichte's and Schelling's versions of the argument amount to the following: in any of our acts of thinking, representing, cognizing, etc., the I is always presupposed. Put differently, and in a way clearly radicalizing the Kantian standpoint, in any of our mental acts, the I is always already implied, not only as accompanying all of our representations as Kant has it, but as grounding and as making possible of these acts. That's the post-Kantian idea. Fichte presents a straightforward version of this ineluctability argument in saying, whoever wishes to do so can always investigate what he would know if his I were not an I, that is, if he did not exist. So you may all try that. What would you be able to think if you did not exist, or if your I was not an I? And Schelling follows up on this in his Of the I by exclaiming, I am because I am, that takes possession of everyone instantaneously. Also, das ergreift jeden plötzlich is the German. Now, this self-referential perspective that is already implied here points to a second strategy in pointing to the I as the first principle, this one building on the I's inner structure. And the argument is as follows. The I, conceived of as pure self-consciousness, is the only case of knowledge in which subject and object of knowledge, or subject and object of consciousness, are given immediately, at one and the same time, and by virtue of one another, as one and the same, this is, as identical. Fichte again makes this very clear by saying the I is necessarily identity of subject and object, subject-object, and it is so without further mediation. So you can't think yourself without being, and vice versa. Thus, if there is supposed to be one unity of our knowledge at all, we must reconstruct this unity in starting from the I as its seed and principle, for only in the I there is an original and irreducible unity as immediate identity. And of course, I'm underlining identity, and I'm also underlining without further mediation. Now, this structural argument, if you want to call it that, or identity argument, too, has different versions. Schelling, on his part, focuses on the identity of being and thinking, and in saying that the I is by being thought, and is being thought because it is, simply because it is only in as much as it is being thought as it thinks itself. So this is the subject-object character of pure self-consciousness as an immediate unity of subjectivity and objectivity. Thus, according to Fichte's and Schelling's early philosophy, the unconditional principle of all philosophy is the pure I as identity of subject and object, of being and thinking, and everything else has to be derived from this one first principle. And I'm just saying in brackets, basically, although Fichte and Schelling doubtlessly differ already in this early period, so they're not one and the same person, of course, I take it that this is, on a structural level, the shared basic position of both, which actually gets German idealism started. So that's the positive side in a way. And now I'm turning to the problem here. So finally, in this first section, the longest section, where then is the problem? Now, the clearest way to address the issue at stake here might be to address it as the problem as a transition, the problem of the transition from the grounding principle of philosophy to any further proposition of the envisaged system. For if we are supposed to think of the I as unconditional, immanent, self-relating principle of philosophy, the question is, how then can we in fact derive or even deduce, in a strong sense, anything else from this immanence, because the I is only pure immanence? This problem can be rephrased in several ways, and that makes it clearer, I hope. For instance, we can put this in terms of immediacy and mediation. If the I is that presupposition which underlies all of our knowledge as the, in itself, immediate ground, then how does mediation and reflection come about? How can this be derived from the immediacy? Or we can put the same problems in terms of grounding and positing. And this is, in fact, the way Fichte himself puts it in his most illuminating take on the issue. In a letter to Reinhold, he puts the principal question, die Hauptfrage, of his Wissenschaftslehre as follows. If the I originally only posits itself or grounds itself is this immediate, immanent self-relation, how then does it come to posit something else as well, as posited as opposed to itself? How does it happen that the I goes outside of itself? Wie kommt das Ich dazu, aus sich selbst herauszugehen? Why is it not just pure I-ness and nothing else? So, rephrased, if the I is essentially and exclusively self-grounding, how can it then ground anything other than itself? And thus, how can it ground the entire system as it is supposed to? Now, I take this problem to be the driving force in German idealist debates, and especially I take this problem as a problem to be the starting point for Hegel. With this in mind, I think the most promising way to coin the problem is in terms of identity and difference. And in this slide, I call this problem the aporia of the principle, die prinzipientheoretische Aporie in German, and this amounts to the following. On the one hand, the grounding principle has to have the character of pure identity, A, to be self-evident, immediate, and univocal as the first principle, so that's the immanent side, and B, to in fact ground the unity, totality, and enclosedness of the system. That's one side of the aporia, and now the other side is. Yet on the other hand, precisely this character of pure identity makes it hard, if not impossible, to in fact derive anything other than itself, and that is difference as such from the identity of the first principle, without, of course, adding anything to the principle externally. For if, and that's the last line of explanation, for if a difference were contained within the principle of identity, the principle would be in danger of being split apart. It wouldn't be this immediate univocal principle. Yet if B, difference is essentially outside of the principle, not at all contained in the principle, then it is hard to see how the identity principle may make a transition to difference, just as Fichte puts it in the letter quoted. Now, I will only briefly sketch the attempt Fichte makes in trying to answer this fundamental question in his foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre. I hope that won't get too much into detail, but I think it's important for what Hegel will be doing in 5 minutes, or 3, I hope. Now, Fichte's first and momentous answer to the problem of transition is to point to a second act, or a second original proposition. And this looks as follows: whereas in the first unconditional act, which constitutes the entire sphere of knowledge, the I posits itself. Now, in a second unconditional act, the I does what Fichte calls a counter-positing of the non-I. That's the second principle. That is, the I posits the non-I in opposition to itself. And this second act of opposing or counter-positing is, on the deepest level, the condition of possibility for any objectivity. So the first is the constitution of the I, and the second is the constitution of any objectivity on a basic level. And it is this key move of transition that incites, I think, all the debates in German idealism, because this is a huge difficulty. For as both acts are unconditional positing, this generates a contradiction, and Fichte points to that as well. The I posited unconditionally and the non-I posited unconditionally too, both mutually nullify one another. So a third unifying act is required, and this is the act of limitation. I and non-I have to mutually limit one another. So this is basically the Kantian categories: reality, negation, and now limitation. But to make this possible, both the I and the non-I have to be posited not as unconditional and unlimited, but themselves as limited and divisible. Teilbarkeit is the decisive term here. Thus, the difference between I and non-I after this third act is a quantitative difference. We have partly, or to a certain degree, I, and partly, and to a certain degree, non-I, or to a certain extent, I and non-I, which is our basic everyday empirical consciousness. We're not everything, but we're there, and there are objects as well. So at least the basic structure of our everyday consciousness. The main problem, to elaborate a bit on that, the main problem here is, as indicated, the transition from the I to the non-I, or from identity to difference. In the Wissenschaftslehre itself, Fichte stresses that the second act of what he calls counterpositing cannot be deduced from the first act. But then it is apparently not derived from the first principle, as Fichte actually said it should be. So already the first move away from the first principle appears to be highly problematic. Yet this implies a second question. So the first is the problem of transition. The third act that I pointed to, this limitation, the synthesis of the two, is obviously supposed to close the gap, yet it indeed rather intensifies the tension. To avoid the outright contradiction between unconditional I and unconditional non-I, the third act of limitation and this second prior act of counterpositing, they are co-original. And I have a graph to visualize that in a second. So not the first and the second are on the same level, but the second and the third are on the same level. In counterpositing the non-I, by means of the negation, both I and non-I are posited as divisible, that is limited. Yet other than one might think, this does by no means transform the unconditional I itself, the first act. This is and remains the principle of philosophy. Rather, this constellation necessarily results in the I, our principle, now taking two quite different positions. First, on the highest level, as the unconditional self-relating I of the first proposition, and then second, as a finite empirical I relating to the opposed non-I. So we have the following tensed constellation. On the first level, there's the thesis, the unconditional principle I, pure self-consciousness, and on the second level, there is a relation of antithesis and synthesis, the finite I and the finite non-I in quantitative difference, and that's empirical consciousness. Now, I'll try to visualize this, and I really hope that's not too much in the detail, but it's important. I hope this will be clear by means of visualization. So the first structure that I have here is what it is not understood, the way that it's not to be understood. So the structure is not to be understood this way, that we have a thesis, the I, then the antithesis, and then the synthesis. If you follow Fichte text, it might look this way, but it's wrong. It's rather to be put this way. On the first level, we have the thesis, and then on a second level, we have the connection of antithesis and synthesis. And now inserting the terms and the content, put in terms of content, it looks like this. We have the absolute I on the highest level, and then we have empirical consciousness on the second level, limited I and limited non-I relating to one another. So there is an obvious tension between the unlimited self-identical I on the first higher level, this one here, and the limitative quantitative difference on the second lower level. And again, it is hard to see how these two levels might be mediated. Most of all, because the unconditional principal I is supposed to remain pure identity, as Fichte repeatedly stresses. So we basically, and this is the end of the first longer part, basically we have two problems. First, the problem of transition from first to the second proposition, or from identity to difference. And second, the problem of mediation between the level of pure consciousness, the higher level, and the level of empirical consciousness. And now what is important is, I don't take these issues to be circumstantial, or even referring to a mistake of Fichte, which could be easily fixed. So we can't say, okay, Fichte gets it wrong, we will just adjust it and correct it. That doesn't work. Rather, I take this problem of transition to be essentially implied in the very attempt of early post-Kantian idealism as such, namely to ground the system of reason on one single first principle. It's unavoidable if you try to do that. If you think there must be one principle, then it's unavoidable to have the problem. That's my claim. Maybe a bit too bold. You can challenge me on that, but I think it's true. At the same time, the systematical challenge posed by these issues is precisely what stimulates the further development in German idealism. And first of all, and I'm just pointing to that very briefly, in Fichte himself, who already in section 5 of his Grundlage or foundation comes up with attempts for different solutions, mainly by trying to insert an internal diversification into the unconditional I, which generates some further problems. But I'll make the move to Hegel now, finally. And the second section is entitled, the following two will be shorter. Hegel's affirmation and first dissolution of the principle in the difference essay 1801. Now, to see how Hegel enters this debate, or how he relates to this problem, and how he relates to the issues just sketched, I will indeed have to do a short summary overview of some progressions in German idealism, which is now, in this short section, utterly reductive, but unavoidable for the sake of time. Now, in 3 steps from Fichte to Hegel. The first debate in German idealism, and I think you all know that, does not directly address the principal issues I just sketched, but rather refers to the relation between subjectivity and nature being discussed between Fichte and Schelling. And there's lots to say about this, and I think this is also a very instructive debate for discussions today, but I have to keep it super short. The basic point is the following. In Schelling's view, Fichte's philosophy, centered on this I, is one-sided, as it cannot account for nature as being active and productive as well. This is, of course, a realist worry, if you will, and Schelling tries to solve it by introducing a second basic science in philosophy, and that's his famous philosophy of nature, and namely as the objective and realist complement to Fichte's idealist subjective transcendental philosophy. This sounds very schematic, put it that way, but I have to leave it at that. Now, second, in their letter exchange around 1800, Fichte points to the immense problems in this idea of Schelling, in Schelling's philosophy of nature. And mainly, also here, just the very basic point, Fichte shows, and I think quite convincingly, that Schelling's system simply falls apart into 2 sides. It consists of 2 independent sciences or activities, and it lacks a unity, and it lacks one unifying principle, as they had agreed there must be in the early works. Now, Schelling, third and final step of this very quick, short progression, Schelling sees the need to provide an answer. And he does so by pointing to an even higher principle, which he now terms reason itself, and he defines it as the total indifference of the subjective and the objective, or as absolute identity, thus laying ground for both transcendental philosophy, the subjective side, and philosophy of nature, the objective side. Now, although supposedly on a higher level, structurally, this again is apparently an identity principle. And therefore, on a structural level, which is what I'm focusing on here, the basic problems I sketched above reoccur on a different level or from a different starting point. Namely, if the principle of everything is actually pure identity, that's Schelling's claim, which is of course very difficult and tough, but that's his claim, the principle of everything is actually pure identity, then the question is, how can we indeed derive difference from this first unifying principle of absolute identity? And first of all, how can we derive the basic difference between consciousness, the subjective side, and nature, the objective side, from this pure identity, which is supposedly the essence of all things? Now, all this would require, of course, much more elaboration, But the point I want to make is that it is precisely in this context that Hegel enters the debates in putting forward his first treatise, the difference between Fichte's and Schelling's system of philosophy. Now, with regard to the first principle, let me highlight also here 3 points about this entry of Hegel. Now, the first point is, it might come as a shock to readers of later Hegel how he, in this early text, indeed enthusiastically embraces the idea of one first principle of identity and Fichte's insight into this principle. And that is why many readers say it's not really an original Hegel text, which I absolutely disagree with. We will see that Hegel's original insight, if I may put it like that, is in this very text. But he starts with this enthusiastic embracing of the idea of a first principle. And Hegel states in the preface that the principle of Fichte's system is the pure thinking that thinks itself, the identity of subject and object in the form I is I. If one holds solely and directly to this, one has the authentic principle of speculation boldly expressed. Man hat das kühn ausgesprochene echte Prinzip der Spekulation in Fichte. And Hegel even goes on to say that by putting forward this principle, Fichte has, and I quote again, established the pure concept of reason and of speculation, and thus made philosophy possible. So according to the 1801 Hegel, only by means of the principle of the I is philosophy possible. So in the first place, Hegel does fully embrace the idea of one first principle of identity, rather in the Schellingian than the Fichtean version, but Fichte is the one to make philosophy possible, as Hegel puts it here. However, second, it is decisive to see that Hegel at the same time also sharply criticizes Fichte's approach. And the core passage here is the following. However, as soon as speculation steps outside of the concept that it establishes of itself in Fichte and evolves into a system, it abandons itself and its principle and does not return to it again. It surrenders reason to the understanding, übergibt die Vernunft an den Verstand, and passes over into the chain of the finitudes of consciousness from which it never reconstructs itself again as identity and true infinity. Transcendental intuition, das ist die transzendentale Anschauung, so the self-cognizing of the I, the principle itself thereby assumes, and this is very important, transcendental intuition, the principle itself, thereby assumes the awkward posture of something that is in opposition to the manifold deduced from it. So that's Hegel's complicated terminology, but I'll try to elaborate a bit on that. So Hegel's critique of Fichte isn't quite that which Schelling had put forward in the name of nature and realism. Rather, he criticizes Fichte in terms of what we might call a system theory, eine systemtheoretische Kritik, or in structural terms, and thereby indeed brings the question of identity and difference to the fore, which was implicit in the Fichte problem, but not really explicit, and Hegel makes it explicit. Now, this is Hegel's version of the issues I have sketched above. Of course, I'm saying that with some irony. Now, Hegel locates the problem in the way in which Fichte makes the transition from the principle to the system. That is how he takes the second step in the system. For according to Hegel, Fichte posits difference or separation in such a way that it remains an irreconcilable separation. In a remarkable fashion, Hegel already here makes a move that we can call a proto-dialectical move. The principle of philosophy in Fichte's mind is supposed to be unconditional in Fichte, yet in fact, and according to Hegel's critical interpretation, it is in opposition to what follows from it. That is, Hegel's critical analysis points to what we can term a conditionality by exclusion, or a being conditioned by excluding, Bedingtheit durch Ausschluss in German. So that's my attempt to rephrase that. Fichte's unconditional principle, the I, only is the unconditional principle by excluding what it is not, by means of negation, of course, namely by excluding finitude, difference, or a non-I. Yet this means that the principle is actually conditioned by and determined by what it excludes. So it is only possible to speak of an I if we negate the non-I, finitude, difference, and so forth. And precisely for this reason, it is not what it is supposed to be. It is not itself unconditional. And this critique is quite obviously, I think, the seed for Hegel's own dialectics as unfolded later on. Finally, third and last point in this second section, finally, Hegel draws quite far-reaching conclusions from this critique. Namely, he already in 1801 points to a transformation of the idea of a first principle of identity in a way that brings the principle close to its dissolution or abolishment. It is in his presentation of Schelling that Hegel inserts his own idea of what this first principle should look like in writing the following. And I'm not getting into the question how Hegel tries to say that this might be Schelling's principle, but it's actually not. I just take it that this is Hegel's own idea of the principle, and we don't find it in Schelling in his 1801 identity philosophy. So, famous lines: the claims of separation must be admitted just as much as those of identity. So separation must be admitted just as much as identity. Hence, the absolute itself is the identity of identity and non-identity. Being opposed and being one are both together in it. Famous lines, but I think it's important to see the background, and this is not so often done, to include the Fichte passages where we actually see where Hegel takes this from. Here, Hegel puts forward his own conception of identity, which differs quite significantly from the early version in Fichte, but also from the absolute identity in Schelling. True identity is only as the identity of identity and non-identity. That is, identity and non-identity are co-original within identity. Put differently, if difference is not always already contained in identity, as Fichte has it, we will never be able to bring out difference from the first principle or of the first principle. And only by including difference can the principle be truly unconditional, that is, non-exclusive and not one-sided, as he has criticized with regard to Fichte. This idea is already foreshadowed in a passage earlier on in Hegel's essay, in which he now explicitly criticizes the idea that philosophy should start with an original proposition, ein erster Grundsatz. Here, Hegel develops a highly original and speculative interpretation of the proposition of identity, A is A. And this works quite the way we have seen in Hegel's critique of Fichte as well. Hegel puts it this way: if A is A, the proposition of identity is supposed to only express mere identity, it is conditioned by the difference it excludes, or it supposedly excludes. But in fact, Hegel argues, the very formula A is A already implies a relation, and thus an internal difference, because this formula A is A, as it distinguishes between the two A's and relates them to one another. So that's Hegel's key move. There's a difference and a relation in the A is A between the first A and the second. In Hegel's own words, A is A contains the difference of A as a subject and A as an object, together with their identity, just as A is B contains the identity together with a difference. And that's original Hegel and nowhere to be found in Fichte and Schelling at this time. So in short, Hegel's move is apparently to place difference in identity, because otherwise we won't make it to derive difference from identity at all. And my basic point here is that the critique of Fichte leads Hegel to thinking otherwise of identity and difference, namely that way that I just unfolded. But this then, and decisive conclusion, but this then is no longer presents one immediate unity to start from, but rather a self-relating process of differing positions within identity, that is, a dynamic identity, which implies a progression. Thus, although Hegel in 1801, which I called shocking in the beginning, although Hegel in 1801 still adopts the vocabulary of a very first principle, we can clearly see how he undermines this very idea of a pure, unified, immediate principle and brings it close to its dissolution. Yet the work in which Hegel will explicitly do so and outright abandon the first principle, however, is the Phenomenology of Spirit, and that takes me to my third and slightly shorter part. Now, the full dissolution of the first principle and the dialectics of the beginning in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Now, in this section, I will move through two essential claims which Hegel puts forward in the preface to the Phenomenology, quite well-known claims, which will serve as a background for reading a passage which I think quite explicitly derives the dialectics of the beginning from the dissolution of the first principle. Now, first, one of the famous claims in Hegel's preface, you all know that, is that the true is the whole, das Wahre ist das Ganze. Now, if you look back at Fichte and Schelling, it might appear that Fichte and Schelling should easily be able to agree with this. The true is the system, and the system is the whole, and constructing the entire system is precisely what Fichte and Schelling had tried to do in starting from the one first principle, so it seems that Hegel is just doing the same thing. However, as you all know, Hegel unpacks this claim by saying that thus, the true is only in the development, and ultimately only in the completed development, that is, in the result and in the end, also well-known claims. And already in this regard, Hegel contrasts this idea to that of first principles and the very first absolute insights, and this is where I put the stress. The beginning, the principle, or the absolute as it is at first, or as it is immediately expressed, is only the universal, nur das Allgemeine. But just as my saying all animals can hardly count as an expression of zoology, it is likewise obvious that the words absolute, divine, eternal, and so on do not express what is contained in them. And it is only such words which in fact express intuition as the immediate, so the immediate grasping of the first principle. Whatever is more than such a word, even the mere transition to a proposition or to a sentence, ein Satz, is a becoming other which must be redeemed, ein Anderswerden, das zurückgenommen werden muss, das heißt eine Vermittlung, or it is mediation. So what Hegel is doing is indeed the following, if we have in mind what we did in the first part. He reverses the entire order of the system as it had been in Fichte's and Schelling's earlier attempts and turns it upside down. The truth is not in the principle as the immediate insight and beginning from which all further truth is then derived. Rather, such absolute principles or absolute intuitions are empty and lacking meaning. The truth, by contrast, is only in the result, the end, and the truth thus implies a development, a further development of the beginning. This development, however, is in no way a mere linear deduction, but a becoming other, an alienation, a contradiction to the beginning, which must then be taken back or resolved. This, however, implies that the supposed first principle is not the true principle or ground of the system, which is in itself already true, but rather must be negated. This takes us to a second famous claim in Hegel's preface, the most famous of all, perhaps, namely that the truth is not as substance, but just as much as subject. And this notion of subjectivity, too, might at first glance sound like early Fichte and Schelling could easily agree, as it resembles the pure I as the true principle of philosophy. The principle is not merely objective, but it is subjectivity, and Fichte and Schelling could say, okay, yeah, that's the absolute I. And indeed, Hegel even uses the Fichtean notion of a movement of self-positing. He uses in this very section this notion of self-positing, which is a Fichtean term, to describe this subjectivity. However, again, Hegel thinks precisely the opposite of what early German idealism had thought. For in Fichte and early Schelling, the I was pure and immediate identity without any internal relation. That was the point. What is the most simple instance in our knowledge? Our pure I-ness, the immediate identity of subjectivity and objectivity. Yet in Hegel, conversely, subjectivity is essentially negativity, as you all know. In short, the true is essentially relation or relationality. Negativity as subjectivity is a structure that at the same time essentially relates to itself and differentiates itself from itself. And in German that would be sich auf sich beziehen und zugleich sich von sich unterscheiden. This is how I would put this. This, however, means that there is no essential immediate unity as such and no initial pure principle as such. Conversely, what is true can only be expressed in a progression which runs through a becoming other or contradiction and redeems this becoming other. And the true is only truly the true once it comes full circle, that is, in its result, which includes its beginning. So the beginning is a part and not only the highest point from which we derive it. Hegel puts that as follows, and I'm highlighting the critical references to the idea of a first principle or a first unity. Famous passage. Furthermore, the living substance is being that is in truth subject, or what amounts to the same thing. It is in truth actual only insofar as it is the movement of self-positing. We have the Fichtean notion in a non-Fichtean sense, or that it is the mediation of itself and its becoming other to itself. As subject, it is pure, simple negativity, and as a result, it is the estrangement of what is simple. That might be the most important phrase here. Entzweiung des Einfachen. Or it is the doubling which posits oppositions and which is again the negation of this indifferent diversity and its opposition. That is, Hegel says it again, that is, it is only the self-restoring sameness, the reflective turn into a self in its otherness. The true is not, and this is the negation of the first principle idea, the true is not an original unity as such, or not an immediate unity as such. It is the coming to be of itself, the circle that presupposes its end and its goal and has its end for its beginning, and which is actual only through this accomplishment and its end. Far, I'm elaborating a bit, far from being simple unity and original or immediate unity, the true is precisely and ineluctably the Entzweiung, that is, the rupture or the undermining, the splitting of a simple unity. Put differently, the true is essentially not immediate unity, the true is essentially not immediate identity, but it is that difference, namely negativity, which always already has undermined simple identity, and in fact constitutes any identity. A difference, however, that we cannot even call original difference, as it as such undermines any idea of a simple and profound ground or origin of the system. It should be clear, I hope, that Hegel here fully unpacks what he had indicated in the formula of an identity of identity and non-identity in the difference essay. So this is the elaboration of that, I think. Along these lines, he dissolves, and now explicitly, the idea of a first simple grounding principle or of pure identity. And I think, and this is sort of my interpretation, and I think he does so precisely in light of the problem of transition and difference, which I had indicated earlier on. As we can simply not develop difference from identity without a hiatus, Hegel puts the idea upside down. He places difference first and as irreducible, yet in such a way that it implies and actually is nothing other than a progressive unity, this self-restoring sameness. And therefore, it cannot be viewed in any way as foundational or original. So I'm not saying Fichte and Schelling have original identity and Hegel has original difference, but Hegel undermines, by putting difference first, the very idea of originality or of an original ground. Yet I think it is equally clear, and I want to stress that Hegel does not simply oppose to the idea of a first principle, such that he would only criticize it and come up with an entirely different suggestion out of nothing. Rather, I think we can observe Hegel productively transforming the idea of an identical first principle in light of the difficulties entailed in this idea, and thereby dissolving it. So productive transformation and dissolution. Now, I will close my talk with the passage I promised, in which Hegel now directly and explicitly abandons the idea of a first principle, and in which he develops his dialectics of the beginning in departing from this idea. Final section. In one of the following sections, Hegel writes, among the many consequences that follow from what has been said, so this subjectivity-negativity thesis, this in particular can be underscored. It is only as a science or as a system that knowing is actual and can be given an exposition. We already know that. But now he turns to the principle. And furthermore, that any so-called fundamental proposition or first principle of philosophy, if it is true, is for this reason alone also false, just because it is a fundamental proposition or a principle. And there's, of course, some Hegelian irony here that he says, if it is true, it is at the same time false. It is consequently very easily refuted. Its refutation consists in demonstrating its defects. However, it is defective because it is only the universal, or only a principle, or it is only the beginning. If the refutation is thorough, then it is derived from and developed out of that fundamental proposition or principle itself. The refutation is not pulled off by bringing in counter assertions and impressions external to the principle. Such a refutation would thus generally be the development of the fundamental proposition itself. It would even be the proper augmentation of the principle's own defectiveness, if it were not, usually, to make the mistake of focusing solely on its negative aspect without taking note of its results and the advances it had made in their positive aspect. Conversely, the genuinely positive working out of the beginning is at the same time just as such a negative posture towards its beginning, namely a negative posture towards its one-sided form, which is to be at first only immediately or to be purpose, Zweck. It may thereby be taken to be the refutation of what constitutes the ground of the system, but it is better taken as showing that the ground or the principle of the system is in fact only its beginning. Some few comments on that before I end. Based on what I have developed before, I hope it is clear what is going on in this section. Hegel does, of course, and obviously refute the idea of a first principle, but we also see that this doesn't amount to a simple external refutation. Rather, what we have in this passage is a beautiful instance of Hegel's immanent critique, which at the same time develops a key insight of his system. In particular, I think what Hegel unfolds here is the idea of conditionality by exclusion, or being conditioned by excluding, which I had pointed to in the difference essay. The principle, even if it is true, is one-sided, a one-sided truth, as it excludes what it is not, and is therefore conditioned by or dependent on or of what is actually supposed to follow from it. So the move that we had in the difference essay where Hegel criticizes Fichte. And the mistake in early Fichte and Schelling, if we even want to call it a mistake, is merely to take a one-sided truth to be the entire or the whole truth, most notably to put the I as first principle in opposition to a not I, which the I itself is not, the Fichtean version, or the Schellingian version, or to put absolute identity in opposition to a difference, which this identity is not in its essence. That's Schelling's identity philosophy. By contrast, what was supposed to be the principle, the original ground of the system, is actually only its beginning. This then, reformulating the principle as the beginning, leads to Hegel's momentous differentiation between the negative and the positive side of further developing the beginning, whereby both sides are irreducibly intertwined. The negative development is the negating or the negation of the immediacy of the beginning, progressive or progressing towards its negation, which is, however, not external or other to the beginning, but already necessarily implied in the immediacy of the beginning, as this immediacy is in itself negativity, that is, exclusion of mediation and determinacy. Thus, the negative development is, in fact, at the same time, the positive development or the augmentation of the lack, that is, the negativity of the beginning as such. And at the same time, the positive progression to the second concept of the system. Thus, the positive development is the negative refutation and vice versa. Thus, as said repeatedly, Hegel doesn't simply abandon the first principle. That is my main point today. Rather, he productively transforms it. He unfolds the immanent negativity in the supposedly merely positive and immediate principle, and thereby develops his dialectics of the beginning precisely from this dissolution of the principle. And I think one could easily show that this idea, show that this idea is in the background of Hegel's more extensive reflections on the beginning in the science of logic, mainly in the section with what must the beginning of science be made that we have in the title of our seminar. Specifically, I think we could show that Hegel's double idea of a progressive and a regressive movement builds on what we find in the Phenomenology preface as just quoted. For Hegel writes in the Logic and this section that indeed progression is a retreat to the ground, to the origin, and to the truth on which that with which the beginning was made and from which it is in fact produced depends. Here again, we encounter the motif of a conditionality by exclusion, or being conditioned by excluding, which I pointed to in the difference essay. Precisely because the beginning itself is dependent on what it excludes, that is, what it is not, the progression at the same time amounts to a regression which reconstructs by moving forward what is in fact, and at the same time, the condition of the beginning. But this is up for discussion. I just wanted to point to this text briefly. I will leave it at this, and I thank you very much for your attention and your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Schwab. I think we don't need the text anymore. Yes. And now I see there are several hands of many people who raise their hands. And I see the hands no more. Please, for the questions, raise your hands. Yes, I see. Stephen Bonhoff, please, you can make the question.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I totally agree, and I have just want to enhance on one point you made, that we have somehow a kind of schizophrenic double movement in the Differenzschrift, in this difference essay, that Hegel is pointing strongly against this idea of a first principle, but on the other hand is totally affirmative of some thoughts and ideas Schelling has. And one issue for me, which I'm struggling with, is the way he rejects Spinoza, that he's saying in the Differenzschrift that it's obscure and totally horrible to make a philosophy and to start a philosophy the way Spinoza did it, with the first principle. And then a few lines later he writes, well, the absolute I, the identity idea, is totally perfect in the Schellingian sense. And I have the feeling what Hegel says at some points is that he's making this distinction between a causality relation and a correspondence relation. He says that Schelling is working in a way in a correspondence matter, and Spinoza, for example, and also Fichte, I think he argues, is working with a causality idea, that the absolute I is causal, with causality producing something. So it's a way which introduces distinctions and limitations, and that's an idea I have, but I would like to know your thoughts on this, because it's just as I said, it seems a little bit schizophrenic on the first view.
Yes, thank you very much. A great question. So on the schizophrenic side, I agree with that. There's two sides, which is super interesting, because in the preface, Hegel begins by pointing to two sides in Kant and two sides in Fichte, and then he says Schelling has everything. And we as readers can point to two sides in Hegel, the one where he looks like he's a Schellingian and says the principle of identity is the totality and it's the right thing. And then the points where he, deviates from Schelling and does something differently. And I think the point is that Hegel thinks the principle can be what he will later call negation. And he doesn't so clearly see that the idea of a principle as such has to be abandoned. So what I don't think is, as some interpreters say, that Hegel is doing politics. I think he thinks the Schellingian idea is that in identity there must be some sort of negation and something relational going on and the non-identity going on. And that is the true way to think the principle. And then in 1807, that starts in 1806 in the Waste Book and so forth, he says, nah, not really. The idea of a principle as such is the problem. So I think what we take to be schizophrenic is actually just Hegel struggling with where can I open up the structure of identity for difference. And I think in 1801, he really still thinks that is in terms of principle. And later on, he says, no, we have to drop that term because the principle always implied something that is other than the principle and so forth. So that's that. And the Spinoza point, I think I read that differently. We would have to look at the text, and we're not doing this right now because it will take too much time. But he says something like, kein Anfang kann ein schlechteres Aussehen haben, als der, den Spinoza mit obersten Sätzen macht. So no beginning can look worse than the Spinozistic beginning. But then in this passage, I think he's trying to say, actually what Spinoza is doing is an antinomy. And so an antinomy between the first and the second proposition of the ethics. And that's actually great. And I think that if you read the passage that way, then it entirely makes sense that he says the causal relation is the Fichtean. One is the cause and the other is the effect. And in Spinoza, precisely because it's a self-causing relation, that's the immanence that must contain difference, and that's the true way of doing philosophy. So we would have to reread these passages and see if there's a criticism of Spinoza. I think actually not, but that's open for discussion and of course for interpretation. But thanks, great question.
Yes, I see another proposition. Martin Witwer, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, one short reaction to the question by Steffen, and then another question, an actual question. I think also, like, I would agree that it's a bit schizophrenic, or rather that Hegel. I think Hegel knows that. I would say that in 1801, Hegel already knows that principles probably don't work, but he doesn't know what to do instead. That is, I would say, how it is. And because you can read many things in different ways, like that Grundsatz problem with Spinoza, you can read that in a sense where the problem is that it's a Grundsatz, and then you can read it in the sense how already Fichte and Schelling differentiate between Grundsatz and principle, and say the Grundsatz is only the expression, while the principle is actually true. And then later, when Hegel comes up with this identity and non-identity thing, he puts it at the place where Schelling puts the principle. So it still looks like a principle, at least. So I would say he probably just doesn't know what to do else. But it's a complicated thing. The actual question would regard the beginning of the science of logic and how you would, just how you would react to the idea that basically at the beginning of the science of logic, the way he describes the principle in the pre-chapter, wo muss der Anfang der Wissenschaft gemacht werden and so on, whether that is still actually the description of a principle, how it would be described by Fichte and Schelling, basically on a meta-theoretical level, or whether Hegel describes something different. Because in my opinion, he basically describes, perhaps in a radicalized version, a principle, how Fichte and Schelling would describe it, but of course in the background is already lurking the intent to do the immanent critique that he already describes earlier. But in my opinion, what he describes there, der Anfang der Wissenschaft, is basically still a principle. Just in the background, there's what then happens with it is this transformation that I think you pointed to.
Okay, thanks. Great question as well. Yes. So I'll try to keep it short so that we still have time for a lot of discussion, and I'll invite any sorts of questions. Yes, I think we can actually work in the difference essay with the distinction of principle and Grundsatz. I think that works all the way. That the Grundsatz is wrong, that's the Reinholdian version, the Reinhold version, to have a first proposition. And Schelling attacked this idea of a first empty, dry sentence already in 1795, 96. And Hegel follows up on that and says, no Grundsätze, please. No foundational propositions. But the principle can be something that is not that simple, dry, theoretical thing. It can have this, identity of identity and non-identity structure. I think he still thinks that a principle can be that. And then later on, he says principle and Grundsatz and all that, intellectual intuition and so forth, it's all the same. Because it's the same with intellectual intuition. I want you to keep it short, but I have to say that. He still affirms in some passages this intellectual intuition and says that it's one side of the truth in a way. And I think it's the same thing. Transcendental intuition and principle still work for Hegel in a certain way, although he's on the way to undermining that already in 1801. So that's the way that I would read it. Now, the other thing is a tricky one, and also here we would have to look at the text. I don't read it that way. I think it's a valid reading that you have, but I don't read it that way. I think that in the first 3 paragraphs or sections of this text, he speaks about the principle in a Fichtean Schellingian matter. But then when he himself describes how the beginning of science must be made, I think he just changes the idea. And he changes the idea with the unity of being and thinking to start with, that he derives from the Phenomenology, or that we can also have in an immediate fashion. He changes that idea such that this already always implies the negativity that I tried to ascribe to the beginning. So put again, I think when he speaks about the principle, he means the principle, but then from page 2 of this essay on, when he speaks about pure being, I don't think so. Because he already says that it's immediacy and mediation at the same time, and then he has the way to point back to the Phenomenology and point to the immediate starting. But this already implies this circular structure that the beginning is only the beginning, as I quoted from the Phenomenology. So I would say that's implied in what he's doing in the Phenomenology, and that's implied in the science of logic as well. That's the way that I would read it. But we can disagree on that, no problem at all.
Okay, thank you. I see another hand. Jinhua Hao, please.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a problem about the structure of the thesis and the antithesis in Fichte's Wissenschaftler. Entschuldigung, my question is that when I reading the Fichte's lecture, I find that I think that synthesis is important as than the identity. So I want to know warum, why the structure was ist the structures synthesis is important. My point is that Professor Schwab presented synthesis and antithesis, and synthesis is run thinking about. Ich think warum. I'm not sure what I clearly present my question. I hope.
Yes, absolutely. Your German and your English is both great, by the way. Yes, I think you're pointing to lectures and the further development that Fichte is making. And that's a part I skipped. I was a bit over time anyway, so I skipped that. Fichte and Schelling and Hegel are all wrestling with this problem. I focused on Hegel today, and I think that's important to see how Hegel gets his idea of the dialectics of the beginning from these early discussions. But of course, Fichte and Schelling don't just leave it at that. In section 5 of the Grundlage, paragraph 5, Fichte starts inserting a difference into identity. And then in the Nova Methodo lectures, that is Fichte's second draft of the Wissenschaftslehre, starting in 1796, he then says synthesis is the highest form. He says the I is thinking and being, and the synthetic unity of this is the unique character of the I. And then you look back at paragraph 1 or section 1 of the Grundlage, the 1794 version, you said, well, Fichte, you said it's basically only a thesis. And he stressed that. And then a year later, he says, no, it has to be a synthesis. And I'm not saying Fichte is making mistakes or just changing his mind. They are all wrestling with this idea. How can we think unity with difference? How can we think identity and difference at the same time? And how do they relate to one another? So you're absolutely right. At a certain point, Fichte says the I must be a synthesis because it's reflection. And this starts in section 5 of the Grundlage. But then when Schelling says, I have my philosophy of nature in 1800 and my transcendental philosophy, Fichte says, no, you need the I. The I is the ideal real, the real ideal, the absolute unity of everything. And without the I, you can't think anything. So Fichte sort of changes between saying the I is a thesis and pure identity, and no, the I must be a complex relation and a synthesis of being and thinking. And Hegel looks at that and says, the solution is negativity. That's the way that I read the constellation. I hope that helps for the question.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. And I see the hand of Vladimir Yalagonia, please.
Yes, so thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. So it's very clear that Hegel is very radical in transforming and overcoming this exteriority between identity and difference. And even on semantic level, on analytical level, or for example, taking the Wesens logic, where identity to say itself, it must open a space as difference, to differentiate itself from itself, to say itself as identical with itself. So it's clear that Hegel is very radical here. But another thing that Hegel is doing with this problem of relationship between identity and difference is that he's transforming this relationship into relation between unity and becoming, Einheit und das Werden. But I'm not quite sure if it is as radical here on this level as it is as he is in relation to identity and difference. It seems to me that he kind of implicitly privileging the identity, the unity, which saves becoming from becoming as poor dispersion. Like it's a unity that saves becoming to become dissemination, so to say. It saves becoming to be safe from poor darkness, so to say. So I wonder what your comment would be on that. Is Hegel as radical on the level of relationship between unity and becoming as he is in case of relation between identity and difference?
Thank you. Great question. And I think these kind of questions show why Hegel is still today the one to get into discussion with, and why it's still so important, because these are, in a way, the questions of our time. How do we think unity and difference? And can we think a unity that has difference within it and so forth? So my answer would be, but it's a deep philosophical question. My answer would be, yes, Hegel is as radical as he is on every level. Maybe not in the Realphilosophie, there we could have some doubt in some spaces. But I would say Hegel is as radical as he is on identity and difference as he is in unity and becoming. And why can I say that? Well, because also the identity difference issue doesn't give you a Derridian or whatsoever sort of dissemination. And even the Wesenslogik doesn't give you that because of negativity. Because negativity still holds everything together. And that's the move. That's the decisive Hegelian move. Hegel thinks radical difference, but he thinks radical difference as negativity. And that always implies a unity. That's the way that I also read the passages in the Phenomenology of Spirit that I quoted, where he says, no immediate unity, no pure origin, no immediacy, no original principle, insight and intuition and so forth, but a restoring unity, a unity that returns into itself. And this is not something that Hegel puts on top. That's how some people read it and say the difference between Hegel and Derrida is that Hegel in the end puts positivity on top. No, that's already in the very concept of negativity, at least the way that I read it. Because negativity is not pure dispersion. Negativity holds together. Subjectivity is negativity, or negativity is subjectivity. That is, it is always an identity of identity and non-identity. That's the way that Hegel reads it. So he has a radical difference and a radical fluidity, but he always thinks that as unity. That's the way that I would read it. Also open for discussion, but I would say this is implied in the identity difference issue and in the unity becoming issue and in any issue, that you have this radical fluidity and no single simple starting point, but always everything hangs together and constitutes a unity. That's the Hegelian idea. And the Hegelian challenge. I don't know if you're happy with that. That's the way that I would read it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Schwab, for your so stimulating conference, and thank you also to all the people who has made questions. We must end this session. Quiero terminar la sesión agradeciendo muy especialmente al profesor Schwab por su conferencia y además invitarlos a todos a la próxima sesión, que será a las 15 horas, a las 3 de la tarde, hora peruana, ¿no? En donde retomaremos esta discusión, porque el tema de la sesión de las 3 de la tarde será precisamente la fenomenología del espíritu y el comienzo de la lógica. De manera que muchas gracias a todos. Thank you very much, Professor Schwab, and we see us in a few hours. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been an honor and a pleasure, and thanks to everybody for the discussion. Thank you very much.